I sat down with Sam Warlow, a young journalist that works at rugbypass.com. Sam is 22 and has grown up in a rugby family his whole life, with his dad being a former Waikato and Māori All Blacks representative. Sam had an interesting opinion on the state of secondary school rugby in New Zealand and his time at the prominent rugby school, Hamilton Boys High.
Well, when I was at Hamilton Boys, obviously we had a really good team, but for the most part, the majority of the team was homegrown or brought in at an earlier stage, like from year 9. So, for example, we had guys who went on to represent at higher honours, like Harrison Levine played for Waikato. He came in from year 9. Bryn Gatland, now with the Blues, he was there from year 9. So my generation, at least, was generally homegrown. There was the odd recruited player, especially towards the sort of tail end. We always had the odd recruit, like the likes of Yosefu Reese, who has actually just recently signed a contract in the Pro 14 to go play with Connacht in Ireland. But I wouldn't say they leaned super heavily on recruitment.
You graduated in 2013. Do you think that since you left Hamilton Boys High School, the recruiting has escalated?
Yeah, I feel like it's the same. I think from memory there are rules in place in terms of like I think this was Rotorua Boys High School had a title strip because they fielded some ineligible players. From memory it was Rotorua, because you had to have been at a school for a certain amount of time before you could only have, I think it was 2 or 3 players who had been there for less than maybe a year or so on the field at the same time. So you couldn't really get away with it as much in certain competitions. There's always a handful of players that would come over from other schools or from the islands, but still the general makeup of the team would have been grown from year 9, because the system in place at Hamilton Boys High School, it kind of had a status. Over time it built up the status as a big rugby school, so it kind of did the recruiting for itself. In a sense, players knew that if they wanted to reach higher honours in rugby, that Hamilton Boys High School would be a good place to go. So building up that reputation of having such a prestigious first 15 side kind of did the recruiting job for them towards the end of my time.
Coming from a small school in the Thames Valley, I saw players leave all the time to chase these opportunities at schools such as Hamilton Boys High School. Do you think that this affects the rural areas and rugby in those rural areas?
Yeah, from like a talent drain perspective, I think, if I'm honest, it's probably in the smaller towns' best interest to let them, I'm sure that they'd want their players to do as good as they can, and if that means pursuing opportunities elsewhere, then that's what's best for them. Obviously the opportunities are better, I say better, but there's more opportunity elsewhere. Like, for example, I spoke with a former Waikato player, Jacob Skeen, and he grew up in Whitianga. He went to Mercury Bay Area School, and growing up he was coming through the Waikato age ranks, went to a couple of camps, and I think at an under 15s camp he was essentially told that if he wanted to go further that he'd have to go to a bigger school here, and then shortly after he transferred to Hamilton Boys High School, and now he's playing professionally in Japan. But I'm sure he still would represent, he knows, he hasn't forgotten where he's from, obviously, which is probably the most important thing if you're coming from those smaller towns.
You talked about players not only from the rural areas of New Zealand, but Pacific Islands being poached for these bigger schools. What's your opinion on these overseas players coming over to play for our high schools?
Yeah, so it's always a tricky debate when you're talking about players from the Pacific Islands. There's always the argument that these boys that come over from the islands are afforded opportunities they wouldn't otherwise be able to have in their home nations. You look at examples like Seta Tamanivalu, Suliasi Vunivalu. So Seta Tamanivalu and Suliasi Vunivalu were both recruited from Fiji, both went to St Kettigan College, and now, first year out of school, Suliasi Vunivalu ended up leading the NRL in tries scored. If it wasn't for those opportunities and that exposure in this Auckland schoolboy rugby scene, he probably wouldn't have reached those heights. And Seta Tamanivalu the same. He went from, and the story with Seta was he wasn't even the one. St Kentigern went over looking for a certain player, and they weren't even looking for Tamani Valu, but they, by chance, happened upon him, brought him over, and now you know he's a 3-time All Black. So just those opportunities, those chance opportunities for these boys, you know, these boys, it's a big, there's a lot of pride. So, you know, if these boys are fortunate enough to have these opportunities, they always grab them with 2 hands and make the most of them. And I'm sure that, you know, there's a lot of, going back to the pride, no matter how far these boys go, there's always a huge element of pride back home, and they never forget where they're from.